Was it a matter of saving the best till last, or did I suffer a crisis of confidence when I set my rotary wire brush to the tank's epoxy filler and green hammerite paint job and revealed the full horror? After a week or two, the optimist's friend, Neil Desperandum, rolled up and infused me with the quite unreasonable self-belief required to tackle it. A replica tank? A piece of cake. Phase 1 was to cut away base sections and saddle, the three parts which form the underside. Grinding back weld seams creates a flat area where I can apply a thin cutting disc. With a bit of gentle persuasion, also known as screwdriver abuse, it comes out in one piece. The upper tank is constructed in 4 sections, a top, 2 sides and a rear, the seams visible inside, and we'll create ours by the same method. The old tank could serve as a buck, but as it did when using the glass fibre replica rear mudguard, that involves a deal of guesswork about what is going on beyond the edges of a fabricated panel. The standard form is to create a wooden buck such as this, copied from the failed glass fibre tank of a Triton. As a fan of Wray Schelin's Pro Shaper channel, I have since discovered the delights of the wire form buck. There's a link below in the video description. First task is to make a drawing, using a flexible magnetic strip to set out numbered stations along the tank. I take profiles with a gauge and draw plan and elevations onto cartridge paper. Join the dots and you have longitudinal lines and cross sections to work from. A bundle of 1/4 inch or 6mm mild steel rod is our path to success. Just as a matter of academic interest, at what precise size does wire become rod? Parallel pins in a piece of angle make a bending block to clamp in the vise. Then we wear a track between there and the bench until each piece fits the plan perfectly. A length of tube slipped over the end increases leverage and control. Most pieces are made in matched pairs. The 2 sides defining the base are tack welded together first. The centre sections, where the saddle is, will be cut away after the top is complete. A loop sets the front edge and is supported with a steel square while a magnetic clamp holds the rear. Then I rest the earth return on one side and make my first tacks. This simple structure already has enough strength that I can turn it over and complete the welds. Longitudinal rods set positions for the top and the side panels and form a guide when cutting blanks. A notch filed in the ends of uprights holds them sprung into place for TIG welding. The result is a surprisingly strong structure, but the real bonus is perfect visibility of the inside of the part you are forming. You can see where it touches the rods and where it doesn't, so there are no excuses for shoddy workmanship, only incompetence. So much for the preamble. Let's get some material on the bench. Like the rest of our Model 50's sheet metalwork, this is 0.9mm cold rolled mild steel. The full sheet we began with is dwindling, but there's still plenty left. I make rough patterns with a generous oversize of about 3/4 of an inch all round. It's a compromise because if the cut is too generous, we'll sweat to shrink a lot of panel which will be cut off later. Shearing the big sheet is awkward, so I carve it up with the plasma torch and trim back to my lines. Then, keen for progress, I dive into the top section with the plastic hammer and sandbag. If you've seen our earlier efforts, you'll already know the form. Stretch the middle and shrink the edge. The top section has quite a gentle curve increasing towards the sides, and it would be easy to overstretch the centre. So after a few minutes I offer it up to the buck, not in a spirit of impatience, but to be sure we don't begin the session with the backtrack which undermines confidence. Quite soon progress is encouraging enough to ditch the sandbag and put some creases into the edge. This rod with 2 pins in the end is a precise method of introducing creases just where you want to shrink. However you create them, the method is to trap the fold of metal from the end so that beating it flat again leaves no option but closing ranks. If it's not too fanciful an image, think of an English lift or an American elevator full of people, when someone dives in just as the doors begin to close. The gap is too small to allow him back out, so everybody has to cram close together to make room. Back on the stump, bring the sides of the crease inward with the plastic mallet, working round the inner end and maintaining the peak while being careful not to allow the little pucker to fold over on itself. Chase these out towards the edge until they disappear and the material gets measurably thicker. The limit to how often you can do this is, like the number of times you'll want to watch me, set by your own patience. After a while, we let the wheel work its magic to knock out the roughness and give a more accurate idea of the shape we have created. Another test shows that the front is pulling down nicely, but the rear still flares away. In time, the generous oversize I have cut becomes an embarrassment, so I mark and trim it to reduce the amount to be shrunk, making sure to leave enough to scribe and trim one last time for that perfect joint. How hard I kick myself up the backside if I overdo it will be in direct proportion to the hours invested up to that point. Here is another method of putting the creases in. A length of 3/4 inch bar with a pin through the end, clamped to pivot in the vise. Pulled down guillotine fashion, it forces steel into the vise jaws. Then use the mallet again to trap the result. Each shrinking action brings the edges a little tighter to that side bar. Go back to the buck at intervals, assess progress, identify the spots for further shrinking, iron out bumps on the wheel, reassess, and never be satisfied, even if you have good reason. When the fit is close, I clamp it to the wire form to see precisely where it touches the buck and where it springs away. We're getting close now, and I use the shrinker to tighten edges. This tool does cut the material slightly, but since my welding is not yet good enough to avoid filler on the seams, that's not a major problem. Now that the edge has pulled in, the panel beyond it has a bulge, but we can shrink that with dents from outside. Turn the panel over, go back to the stump and work around them from the edge until the peaks have no way to escape. Working sheet metal like this does take a certain level of persistence, but it's really not hard. I know little of rocket science, but I'd assess the level of difficulty of sheet metal working about midway between falling off a log and herding cats. Another trial on the wire form, and we can assess the excess there and trim it, followed by more precise shrinking. The day is warming up now, and so am I. Hey, this isn't a strip show. Back at the wheel, we're really putting some shape in. Guiding a piece between the wheels is awkward at first, rather like riding a motorcycle where your hands move the road instead of the wheel running over it. Pulling back, you steer right and swerve left, but like riding a bike, once you get it, you won't even think about it. The wheel is much steadier since I rebuilt it last winter, with a top adjusting wheel and bolted securely to the hydraulic press frame. In time, immersion in the task brings a kind of peace, like a mantra repeated. It takes me beyond impatience and the devilish din beyond my earplugs, though it may be as hard to explain the pleasure I derive as it is to convince a perpetual car driver that choice, not poverty, puts me on two wheels. Another test shows that it's mainly the rear edge which steps away. I'm so involved in the task and its progress that I've lost all track of time. My wristwatch removed for its own safety, but just look at that. No wonder my stomach is rumbling so loud I can hear it in my earplugs. Even as I recap the pen, I hear my mother's voice from 1950. Don't draw on your hands, Jonathan. That's what the paper is for. Is childhood programming why I'm still untattooed? Smoothing in the wheeling machine refines the main shape, and in time our efforts turn a near fit into something which, if not quite held by suction, is getting very close. It may be just a matter of adjusting the arrangement with a twist and tug. rather than altering area values by stretching or shrinking. Note how a press down on the sides makes the ends rise slightly. Forming side panels proceeds in much the same fashion, stretching and shrinking by degrees. So we'll fast track that, and you can take my word that there was no cheating. When both are a good fit to the buck, clamp them on and scribe and trim the straight lower edges. Then clamp them on again, scribe to the upper rails from within. For accuracy, I trim just outside the lines and sand back precisely. Now with the top panel on the buck, offer up each side and scribe along their top edges. If we trim accurately to the lines, the parts will fit like they were made for each other, which they were. The last piece of the top assembly, this back panel, has a relatively simple compound curve. A little work in sandbag and wheel has that completed. The base being cut here begins as a one piece to assist with setting out the top sections. The saddle piece is also being blanked out. With side 1 and the top clamped to the buck, I tack the first seam, giving a few taps to keep them perfectly aligned as I go. We could use the wire buck to align the second side too, but that would trap our wire form with obvious consequences for the Panther Grand Sport's power to weight ratio. Without support, we risk distortion, so the solution is that temporary one-piece base. This is cut about 6 mm over size and a lip formed. Knocking this over puts a dish in because the circumference at the edge was greater and still is after bending. The solution is simple. Shrink it flat. With the top and side assembly on its head, set a support inside for the base. Clamp and tack the flange. Always keep an eye on your gas supply. You'll get some very odd welds if it runs out. With the supports removed, align the second side and tack that to the base. and then turn it over, apply a clamp across the seam at one end and begin a run of tacks, working end to end to avoid the possibility of finishing with extra material that you can't get rid of at the centre. These butted seams do require a little filler rod where we can get away on the base seams with simply welding. So with both sides secured, that just leaves the rear panel. Here I'm clamping it to the base so I can mark edge trims from within. Access is rather restricted. I jam my scriber into the length of aluminium extrusion, peer in with the LED work light. Then take off the clamp, trim, clamp back on the base and tack it there with a couple on the seams. and the base can be removed for better access with the hammer and stake. Finish with intermediate tacks. Checking alignment, tapping flush. Before finally fully welding all the upper seams. There's just time to attach the filler neck before we close this session. I'm salvaging that rather complex pressing from the original tank, removed by grinding off the weld inside and levering it free. I mark and pilot bore its place, taking measures from the original, and then cut with an undersize hole saw before I create a flange by knocking the edge into an offcut of tube. This is then dressed carefully to size with a ball peen hammer until we have a snug fit. It holds itself there as I tack and weld the seam inside for a petrol-proof joint. Part 10 of this series will attend to the other fiddly bits, badge fittings, tap outlets, plus the base sections and saddle, and the brackets which attach it to the frame.